how would you harmonize this situation? So the Old Testament talks about how God sets up kings or emperors or nowadays presidents, prime ministers. So you have Daniel 2:21. God changes times and seasons. He removes kings, raises up kings, gives wisdom to the wise, and so on. With the New Testament teaching, which is also an Old Testament teaching, that behind the nations are demonic forces. So you have Psalm 96:5. In the Greek translation, it says that the gods of the nations are demons. Jesus obviously talks about the prince of the power of the air. Paul calls this the present evil age. And that's why we should be pilgrims, have a mindset of a resident alien. You quoted the John 18, was it, about 1836?
Right.
Our kingdom, our government is not right now. We're waiting a government from heaven, right? That's Philippians.
Right.
Our citizenship is in heaven, from which it's coming down, not that we're going up there. So there are all these New Testament teachings about that. And Romans 13, Paul says there's no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. So how do we harmonize that view with the other view that behind the nations, behind the governments, evil powers? And clearly it's true, because no nation has clean hands, as they say. They're all bloody.
That's a great question, and I think there are two major areas that I would go in, and one of them has to do with what we see as proof positive of how God uses these other nations. We could go historically and biblically back to, your first was Daniel, and you look at what was happening in Daniel's time. God used Nebuchadnezzar to punish Israel. He used the Cyrus and some of the Persian kings. He used them to actually have Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel and others go back, and he used them for good to help rebuild the kingdom of Israel, in Jerusalem, and the wall, the temple, etc. So the first aspect I would say too is biblically and historically, these things, just like Romans 13:4 says, that is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So I would recommend that people would have an attitude of thankfulness for the law enforcement that exists, thankfulness for the governments. Pray for the government, pray for those in a power or authority, because there's a lot of evil that they are keeping at bay. However, if we're serving God and Jesus, and we're looking toward the messianic reign of the King, and reigning from the throne in heaven in a sense, but physically he'll be here on this planet. Let's focus on following his marching orders over whatever others we might want to be led astray with. People to, hey, just go kill somebody else. And this kind of gets in the doubtful aspect of the questioning part of it. Yes, God has appointed ministers, and there could be evil forces behind them, like Psalm 96:5 mentions. But you also have Hosea 8:4. And that was a really big one when I started looking at this topic, because what God is essentially saying through the prophet Hosea is that they set up kings, but not by me. And that's a really good one to if you're going to talk Romans 13:4, because this seems to imply that every king or prince or ruler has not been one that God has ordained to a degree. And so when you look at these things in context, all right, is the question I asked myself and that I would ask others is, how 100% or what percentage of confidence do you have in this authority that's telling you to go kill somebody? Are you 100% confident that they are ordained by God, that this is set up by God, or is this one of the kings that's set up not by him, and it is more of they just want to go bear the sword in vain, and they're not just trying to stop people from busting into our houses and killing our families? Are you that sure? Are you that confident? And my answer was, well, I'm not. I'm going to go with my King, with my Redeemer and what he said, in the new covenant that we're under, rather than playing a guessing game as to which nations are led, by evil powers and which ones God has actually set up.